3,000 seats. That was the capacity of the circular dining hall at Presidio Modelo, built to move a prison population through one controlled space. The complex was designed for 5,000 prisoners, arranged around 5 immense circles that made surveillance part of the architecture. That is the version visible in photographs. The harder story begins after the drawings were finished. Features meant to make the prison modern were abandoned or shut down. Prisoners described something different from the reforming ideal, and Fidel Castro was kept outside the rotundas that made the place famous. So the question is not whether the design could watch everyone. It is what the design could not control. This is the story of a model prison that failed its own model. This is Presidio Modelo. The photographs make the prison look finished. The story starts where the drawings stop. The Isle of Pines was being asked to carry 2 jobs at once in the 1920s. Cuba needed a new penitentiary, and the prison was also expected to help stimulate the island's economy. Punishment and development went into the same plan. That combination mattered. That second purpose is easy to miss because the rotundas swallow almost every photograph. Yet before the cells filled, Presidio Modelo was already being asked to justify itself outside prison policy. The island was supposed to benefit too, which is to say, the planners were not only deciding how men would be confined, they were deciding what kind of state project the island would be made to carry. The name chosen later made the ambition plain: Presidio Modelo, the model prison. Model did not simply mean large, secure, or difficult to escape. The word promise method. This was meant to be a prison whose design did part of the governing. On paper, architecture could do some of the reforming. In practice, architecture first had to be borrowed. In 1925, Interior Minister Rogelio Zayas Bazan traveled to the United States to study prisons. One institution made a particular impression on the Cuban delegation. A Stateville Correctional Center in Illinois used circular cell houses with a central observation point inside a ring of prisoners. The geometry did part of the guard's work. A man in a cell could be seen from the middle, but he could not always know whether anyone in the middle was looking back. And that was the point. Illinois was not where the idea began. The history reached back to Jeremy Bentham and his panopticon, but Presidio Modelo was not a full-scale realization of Bentham's original scheme. Calling it that would make the story cleaner. It would also make it wrong. The more precise description is panopticon-style, with an immediate practical influence running through Stateville. The route was Cuba to Illinois, then back to Cuba. Nearly 3 decades later, one name would make Presidio Modelo familiar far beyond the island. Fidel Castro was held there from 1953 until 1955 with other Moncadistas. But the famous photographs create a false expectation. Castro was not housed inside the giant circular cell blocks that now dominate almost every visual account of the prison. He and his group were kept separately in a hospital ward. That detail is easy to pass over. The photographs suggest one prison experience. Not quite. Here's the part that matters. The most famous prisoner in the history of Presidio Modelo did not live inside the part of Presidio Modelo that made the prison famous. The rotundas became the symbol. His confinement happened elsewhere in the compound. And that was the point, which is to say, that separation will matter later because it prevents 2 very different prison experiences from being folded into one convenient image. If institutional history is what brought you here, subscribing helps these long-form stories find the right audience. By then, none of that had happened. In the middle of the 1920s, the planners still had a blank site and an idea imported from abroad. They had a model in Illinois, a government willing to build, and an island on which a very large institution could be placed. The scale was part of the argument. A prison intended for thousands of men would become one of the most imposing projects on the Isle of Pines. It was supposed to incarcerate, organize, feed, supervise, and move a population through a controlled environment. At the same time, the project was expected to serve the economy around it. This was not being imagined as one building behind a wall. It was a system. Here's where the building stops being the interesting part. A system like this could be drawn with remarkable confidence. Sight lines could be planned. Cell blocks could be arranged. Movement could be separated. A common dining space, workshops, and other reform-minded features could all be fitted into the scheme. Then people had to run it. A drawing could decide where a guard stood. It could not decide how a warden would use a tunnel. It could not decide whether a promised service would survive daily prison administration or what a later government would decide the prison was for. Concrete could hold a shape. It could not hold an intention. Presidio Modelo had not reached that test yet. The project moved forward under the government of Gerardo Machado, and architect Cesar Guerra y Massaguer gave the imported idea its Cuban form. Construction began in 1926 and continued into the early 1930s. The core would look so complete in later photographs that it became easy to assume the plan had been realized exactly as intended. Not quite. The master plan was never completed in full. Before the long story of prison life had properly begun, there was already a difference between the ideal project and the institution that actually existed. That difference would get wider once the gates opened. The idea came home from Illinois. Concrete had to make it work. By the time Cesar Guerra y Massaguer began turning the prison scheme into a real compound, the central idea was already clear. The prison would not rely on one long corridor with guards walking past one door after another. It would arrange men around circles. That changed the geometry. 4 of the completed circular buildings were intended as prisoner blocks. A 5th circle served a different purpose. It was a dining hall built to seat 3,000 men. The whole institution was designed for a population of about 5,000 prisoners, large enough that movement itself became a problem the architecture was supposed to solve. The arithmetic on that is worth doing slowly. A prison population that size had to be counted, fed, moved, separated, watched, and returned to cells every day. If all of those things depended on guards improvising in corridors, the institution would spend much of its time moving bodies from one place to another. The circular plan promised something cleaner. Put observation at the center. Put the prisoners around it. Make sight part of the building, and that was the point. Start with the rotunda, because that is where almost every surviving photograph leads the eye. A man inside one of the cell blocks occupied the outer ring. The observation position stood toward the center. The important thing was not that a guard watched every prisoner every second. He could not. The important thing was that the prisoner could not easily know when he was being watched. That distinction matters. The logic came from the same family of ideas that had made Stateville useful to the Cuban delegation in the United States. But calling Presidio Modelo a perfect Bentham panopticon goes too far. Bentham's original project was more complete, more theoretical, and in important ways different from what was actually constructed on the Isle of Pines. The Cuban prison was panopticon-styled. That is precise enough. Walk out from the cell block, and the plan becomes larger. The rotundas were only the most visible pieces of a compound designed to control circulation between confinement, work, food, and administration. Plans included tunnels linking parts of the site, workshops where prison labor and reform could be organized, and services intended to make the institution look less like an older punitive prison and more like a modern correctional project. Even the smaller details were ambitious. The scheme included radio headphones for cells. It included insect screening. A mobile library was part of the reform-minded program described in the design history. These are not the details people usually associate with the word panopticon because they do not photograph as well as a watchtower. But they matter more to the promise built into the word Modelo. The prison was not only supposed to see, it was supposed to improve. Construction began in 1926 under the government of Gerardo Machado. Work continued into the early 1930s, and by October 1931, the core prison was described as complete enough to hold about 5,000 men. That sentence can make the project sound finished. Not quite. The broader master plan was never completed in full. Work stopped during the economic crisis of the early 1930s, leaving a difference between the prison that had been imagined and the prison that actually stood on the island. The 5 circular structures were there. The complete institutional vision was not. That gap would become important later. There's a temptation with a place like Presidio Modelo to read intention backward from concrete. The buildings are so large, so geometrically certain, that they make every decision look deliberate. A circle looks complete even when the program around it is incomplete. Concrete is good at that. It hides drafts. The dining hall makes the point especially well. 3,000 seats in one circular room suggests control at a scale few prisons attempt. Feeding men in one space could reduce repeated movement between separate dining rooms. It could concentrate supervision. It could make the daily routine legible from a central point. On paper, that is efficiency. In practice, every efficiency creates a dependency. A tunnel works only if the administration wants prisoners moving through it. A library works only if books are allowed to circulate. Headphones work only if someone maintains the equipment and permits prisoners to use it. A design feature has no authority of its own. It did not need to fail physically. It only needed to be ignored. That is the part photographs cannot show. The rotundas survive because walls are difficult to remove. Administrative intentions are easier. They can disappear in a meeting, in an order, or in the routine choices of the men running the prison. And by 1932, the institution had enough concrete to be recognizable as Presidio Modelo. It did not have the complete system that had once been promised around that concrete. The prison looked coherent from the outside, while the operating model inside it was already becoming something else. The buildings were finished enough to fill. The men who would test the model were already coming through the gates. That was the plan. Here is what happened when administrators had to use it every day. Pedro Castells became one of the officials associated with the early operation of Presidio Modelo and some of the first departures from the reform program appeared under his administration. The tunnels that had been designed to connect parts of the compound were closed. Planned services did not develop the way the architectural scheme had suggested they would. The building stayed the same. The routine changed. That difference is the center of this story. A prison can be designed around one theory and operated around another without moving a single wall. The rotunda still placed the observation point in the middle. The cells still faced inward. The dining hall still held its enormous circular form, but architecture had reached the edge of its authority. The radio headphone system envisioned for cells did not become the continuing feature the plan had promised. The mobile library faded with it. These were small losses compared with a cell block, but that is exactly why they are useful. Nobody had to demolish anything. They only had to stop doing it. It is worth saying plainly what that meant for the men on the ground. A feature written into a plan mattered only if a prisoner could actually use it. A tunnel on a drawing did not shorten anyone's movement once it was closed. A library promised in a reform program did not put a book into a man's hands unless the administration kept the system alive. The headphones were no different, which is to say, the reform language could survive after the reform mechanism had gone. Model was still in the name. The prison did not need to announce that a promise had been abandoned. It could continue using the same buildings and the same official identity while the lived institution moved further away from the project that had justified it. That is how institutional drift usually looks. Not a collapse, a substitution. One procedure replaces another. A convenience is withdrawn. A corridor is closed. A service becomes irregular, then disappears. None of those changes is large enough to redefine a prison by itself. Added together, they can redefine the prison completely. Presidio Modelo had another complication. It was never used by only one kind of prisoner, and it did not exist under only one political moment. The population, the purpose, and the government around it would all change. That makes any single description of life inside Presidio Modelo dangerous. There was no single life inside it. A political prisoner held apart from the main population did not experience the prison in the same way as an ordinary prisoner in a rotunda. A wartime internee entered for another reason entirely. Later, Fidel Castro and the Moncadistas would be separated from the regular prison population and placed in the hospital ward. So the walls were constant. The experience was not. This is also why the famous aerial image can mislead. From above, the prison looks like a machine with one operating logic: 5 circles, repetition, central points, order. But a plan that looks uniform can contain different regimes of confinement at the same time. The photograph is true. It is not complete. By the early 1930s, one prisoner began leaving behind a record of what that difference looked like from inside. His name was Pablo de la Torriente Brau. He would spend close to 2 years at Presidio Modelo, and the experience would become the foundation for a book carrying the prison's own name. That title matters. He did not choose a metaphor. He chose the institution. Pablo's account is useful because it brings the story down from the watchtower. Until this point, Presidio Modelo can be explained through ministers, architects, cell blocks, and administrative plans. With Pablo, the question changes. What did a model prison look like to someone who had to live inside the model? That question will carry the next part of the story. If this is the kind of prison history you want more of, there are many more places like it. By then, the contradiction had become difficult to hide. The prison had been conceived as a modern answer to an old problem. Its architecture promised observation, order, and reform. Its early operation had already begun stripping away parts of that promise. The rotundas still worked as rotundas. The model was becoming something else. The prison had a name for what it was supposed to be. Pablo de la Torriente Brau had another version. Pablo de la Torriente Brau arrived at Presidio Modelo on September 16, 1931, among the first group of 24 political prisoners sent there that day. That date gives the story something the architecture cannot provide, a pair of feet on the ground. Pablo was already an opponent of Gerardo Machado's government. Presidio Modelo would hold him for a long stretch of the early 1930s, and the University of Salamanca repository describes his stay as almost 2 years. During that confinement, he conceived and began the project that would become a book with the prison's own name, Presidio Modelo. That choice matters. He did not need a fictional island or an invented jailer. The institution itself was the subject. The book was intended as a denunciation of Cuba's prison system under Machado, of political repression, and of what Pablo described as the mistreatment and exploitation of common prisoners. And he went further. The work also carried accusations of selective killing inside the prison. Those accusations are part of Pablo's testimony and part of the historical record around Presidio Modelo. They should not be turned into neutral fact simply because they were printed in a book. Pablo was not neutral. He was a prisoner and a political opponent of the government that confined him. That is exactly why his writing matters, and exactly why it has to be handled with care. Testimony can tell what a man saw, what other prisoners told him, what he believed was happening, and what he wanted the public to understand. It cannot erase its own point of view. That distinction keeps this story honest. Until Pablo enters the frame, Presidio Modelo can be explained from above. A minister travels to Illinois. An architect draws circles. A government pours concrete. A warden decides which parts of the reform program will survive daily operation. Pablo changes the altitude. Now the question is what the institution looked like from the ring rather than the center. The repository description is unusually direct. Here's the part that matters. He wanted to expose the prison system, the repression of Machado's opponents, and the treatment of common prisoners. Which is to say, the book was not written as an architectural critique. It was written against an institution, and that was the point. That difference is useful because Presidio Modelo had been sold through a language of design. On paper, it was scientific, rational, reforming. A place where geometry, circulation, work, and surveillance would produce a more modern prison. In practice, Pablo began with men instead. One view started with the plan, the other started with the consequences. His book also did not depend on memoir alone. A section titled Documents included prison material, including letters from Pedro Castells. Memory and paperwork therefore entered the same argument, though neither source should be treated as automatically complete. Paper can be selective too. Here is the part that matters for the larger story. Presidio Modelo did not need to collapse physically for Pablo's account to challenge the word Modelo. The circulars could still stand. Guards could still occupy the center. Prisoners could still be counted, separated, fed, moved, and watched. The machine could function. The argument was about what that functioning meant. Pablo continued shaping the work after his imprisonment. By 1935, while again in exile in New York, the manuscript had been completed, but he did not succeed in publishing it during his lifetime. He died in Spain in 1936 during the Spanish Civil War. The book outlived him. Its full publication came decades later. That delay creates another useful caution. A prison narrative can become more famous after the people, officials, and political fights around it have changed. By the time later readers encountered Presidio Modelo as a book, the prison itself had already been used by other governments and other categories of prisoner. The building had kept accumulating meanings. Nobody wrote down a clean moment when Presidio Modelo stopped being the thing its planners had promised and became the thing Pablo believed he had witnessed. There was no ceremony for that change, no wall fell, no rotunda was renamed. The concrete simply kept working. That may be the most useful thing Pablo leaves in this story. Institutions do not always fail by breaking. Sometimes the building performs exactly the task it was built to perform while the purpose around that task changes. Presidio Modelo could still count men. It could still separate them. It could still watch. What it could not do was force the administration using it to preserve the reforming intentions attached to the original plan. The distinction would become even clearer once Pablo's period there was over. Presidio Modelo did not remain a Machado-era prison sealed inside the 1930s. The government changed. The people classified as dangerous changed. The political language changed. The circle stayed. And then a world war reached the island. That transition is easy to rush because the next name is Fidel Castro. It should not be rushed. Before Castro became Presidio Modelo's most famous prisoner, the prison had already shown that it could be repurposed for a category of confinement its designers had not been building around in 1926. During the Second World War, the institution held people identified as enemy nationals. The model had found another use. He was one prisoner. The institution was about to discover that it could be used for more than one kind of enemy. During the Second World War, Presidio Modelo held an estimated 350 Japanese, 50 Germans, and 25 Italians. That was a different crisis. That is precisely why they matter. The buildings did not need a new philosophy before they could accept a new population. They needed a decision. Once the state had a place designed to separate, count, and supervise thousands of people, the category placed inside it could, change faster than the architecture ever would. The circles were reusable. And that was the point. By then, the original language of reform had already been tested by the early prison administration. The wartime episode added another layer. Presidio Modelo was no longer only a national penitentiary associated with Machado's penal project. Part of the same institution could now be used for internment during a global war. Then the war ended. The prison remained. 8 years after the end of the war, another group arrived whose relationship with the state would eventually reverse the meaning of the place. Here's the part that changes the scale. On July 26, 1953, Fidel Castro and a group of armed opponents attacked the Moncada Barracks in Santiago de Cuba. The assault failed. Castro was captured, tried, and sentenced. On October 17th, he arrived on the Isle of Pines with Raul Castro and 24 other compañeros. Here's the part that photographs usually flatten. They were sent to Presidio Modelo. They were not sent into the circular cell blocks. The main rotundas were overcrowded by then, and the Moncadistas were treated as a separate political prisoner group. Fidel and the others went to a hospital ward instead. So the most famous name attached to the prison never occupied its most famous architecture. That is not a technicality. It changes how the story should be pictured. If an image shows Castro imagined behind the open tiers of one of the giant circulars, it gives the viewer the right prison and the wrong confinement. His Presidio Modelo was a different section of the same compound, with a different routine and privileges that the general population did not share. The difference was substantial. The Moncadistas organized their own daily schedule around exercise and study. They assembled a library of roughly 500 books. For about 5 hours each day, they met around a blackboard in the hospital patio for lessons that included philosophy, history, and public speaking. They were also allowed to prepare food to supplement the prison ration. The rotunda was built around uncertainty. A prisoner could not always know whether the center was watching. The hospital ward became a classroom. The contrast is almost too convenient for a documentary. It is also documented. That does not mean imprisonment had become voluntary, comfortable, or harmless. It means one group inside Presidio Modelo occupied conditions that should not be projected onto everyone else. The prison contained different regimes at the same time. The walls were constant. The rules were not. This is where the name Modelo becomes useful again. A model implies repeatability. Build the right institution, follow the right arrangement, and similar inputs should produce similar results. Presidio Modelo did the opposite. Two prisoners could be inside the same named prison and inhabit different systems. Pablo's prison was not Castro's prison. The wartime internees had another one, and the common prisoners in the circulars had another still. Architecture could make those experiences occur on one site. It could not make them the same experience. For Castro, the period on the island became politically useful in ways Batista's government could not have intended. The Moncadistas had time together. They read, they taught each other, they argued and organized. Prison had removed them from public political activity, but it had not separated the leadership group from itself. The design solved the wrong problem. Presidio Modelo had been built around the idea that visibility and controlled movement could shape behavior. The political prisoners in the hospital ward were not being governed through the central eye arrangement that made the prison famous. Their separation from the regular population also gave them a degree of internal cohesion. Concrete could hold them. It could not decide what they did with the time. On May 15, 1955, Fidel Castro and the other Moncadistas were released. That date closes one prison story and opens another. Castro had entered after a failed attack on the Batista government. He left with his political project unfinished. He went into exile, returned to Cuba, and by the beginning of 1959, Batista's government had fallen. The man had changed position. The prison had not moved. There is a familiar temptation at this point to treat Presidio Modelo as a piece of Castro origin mythology. The prison where the future ruler studied, organized, and waited. That version is useful because it has a famous name and a clean reversal. It is also too small. The more important question is what happened to Presidio Modelo after the reversal. If the problem had been Batista, then a new government could close the institution and declare the model finished. The same opportunity had existed after Machado. Each political break offered a chance to say the prison belonged to the order that had just been defeated. The circles offered another possibility. Keep using them. After 1959, Presidio Modelo continued to hold prisoners, including opponents of the new revolutionary government. The political direction changed. The capacity for confinement did not. That is the answer the first half of this story has been approaching. The design could watch prisoners. It could control routes through a compound. It could put observation at the center of a circle. What it could not control was who would inherit the center. The institution had survived Machado. It survived the governments that followed him. It survived Batista. And when Castro's movement took power, the same site that had once held Castro became part of the new government's prison system. Go through enough of these places and the same pattern keeps turning up. A government can inherit a building faster than it can decide whether it has inherited the logic inside it. Presidio Modelo had been called a model. By the end of the 1950s, the word had changed meaning again. The question was no longer whether the prison had lived up to its original reform program. That answer had been complicated for decades. The question was why a prison associated with the old order remained useful to the new one. Castro walked out in 1955. The prison did not. 4 years later, the relationship between the man and the institution reversed. After 1959, Presidio Modelo acquired the reversal that makes its history difficult to fit into a single political story. The government changed. The prison remained useful. The site that had held Fidel Castro under Batista continued to be used by the revolutionary government for confinement, including opponents and dissidents of the new order. The categories changed again. The architecture did not have to. That continuity is more important than the easy irony. It would be simple to say that a former prisoner became a ruler and then used the same prison against his enemies. The reversal is real. It is also too small. Presidio Modelo had already survived Machado, the governments after Machado, wartime internment, Batista, and the Moncada period. Each change had altered who entered the compound and why. The circles kept accepting new definitions of danger. That is what institutional continuity looks like when it is built in concrete. A new government does not inherit only offices, files, uniforms, and employees. It inherits buildings already designed to make certain actions possible. Cells do not ask whether the legal language outside them has changed. Gates do not distinguish one ideology from another. They open inward either way. Go through enough of these places and the same pattern keeps turning up. A government can reject the order that built an institution and still find the institution useful. That does not make the governments identical. It does not make the prisoners identical either. It means the machinery of confinement can outlive the justification that first paid for it. Presidio Modelo had been proving that for decades. The early planners had attached reform to geometry. Castells had shown how quickly administration could move away from parts of that plan. Pablo de la Torriente Brau had written from inside the gap. Wartime internment had given the prison another population. Castro and the Moncadistas had occupied still another regime within the same compound. After 1959, the pattern continued. The most important thing not to do here is flatten those periods into one experience. There is no source strong enough to justify saying that a prisoner under Machado, a Japanese internee during the war, a Moncadista under Batista, and a dissident after the revolution all lived the same prison life. They did not. What they shared was the site. That distinction brings the story back to the question in the opening. Presidio Modelo was designed around the possibility of observation. The rotundas could organize lines of sight. The compound could organize movement. A central tower could make uncertainty part of confinement. But none of that decided what the state would call an enemy. The architecture could not choose its prisoners. Somebody outside the circle always did that. By the 1960s, the prison had outlived the political world in which it was designed. Gerardo Machado had been gone for 3 decades. Batista was gone. Castro, once a prisoner there, now stood on the other side of state power. The original reform program was no longer a useful description of what the institution had become. The name survived anyway. Modelo, a model. Free of context, the word still sounded like a claim about what a prison ought to be. By then, the word had become a historical label. If this reframed Presidio Modelo for you, sharing helps this history find its next viewer. The prison stopped operating in 1967. There is no clean ending in the source base used for this story. No single verified order explains the closure in a way that would let one sentence carry the whole decision, and there is no reason to invent one. The date is clear. The larger motive is not clear enough to state as fact. Nobody wrote down a clean ending. That matters because a neat ending would be tempting. A model prison fails. A government recognizes the failure. The gates close. History did not leave that sequence behind for Presidio Modelo. What it left was a stopping point. After more than 3 decades of changing prisoners, changing governments, and changing purposes, the compound ceased to function as the prison it had been built to be. The cells remained. The circular forms remained. The central observation structures remained. The system stopped before the architecture did. The prison stopped holding prisoners in 1967. The circles stayed where they were. Once a prison stops being a prison, the next argument is about memory. Presidio Modelo entered that argument almost immediately because its buildings were too large, too unusual, and too closely tied to Cuban political history to disappear quietly. Parts of the site moved into museum and educational use. In 1978, Presidio Modelo was recognized as a national monument in Cuba. The label changed again. Prison became monument. The reuse was physical as well as symbolic. In 1978, the main administration building was converted for educational use, and the hospital ward associated with Castro's imprisonment became a museum. Those choices preserved particular pieces of the site while also deciding which parts of its history visitors would encounter first. The circular cell blocks remain the great visual object. The hospital carried the most famous political story. Administration became education. That arrangement is revealing. A former prison does not preserve itself. Somebody chooses which room becomes a museum, which building gets a new function, and which story receives a plaque. Preservation can save walls while still narrowing memory. Presidio Modelo had accumulated more than one prison history by 1967, and no single museum room could contain all of them. That transformation does not solve the contradictions inside the place. A monument can preserve concrete more easily than it preserves differences between prisoners. It can keep a rotunda standing while visitors collapse several decades into one image. It can attach Fidel Castro's name to the prison so strongly that Pablo de la Torriente Brau, the wartime internees, and the ordinary prisoners move toward the edge of the story. The architecture encourages that simplification. 5 circles are easy to remember. Institutional drift is not. From above, Presidio Modelo still looks like an idea drawn with a compass. The repetition is clean. The centers are obvious. The geometry still suggests that somebody believed human behavior could be made orderly if sight, distance, and movement were arranged correctly. That belief is the part that did not survive intact. The original project had imagined more than surveillance. It had included workshops, services, circulation systems, and reform-minded features that were supposed to make the Isla institution modern. Some were abandoned, some never became the durable practices the plan suggested, and the prison went on being useful after the political world that created it had disappeared. The concrete did not object. That is what makes Presidio Modelo worth remembering as more than Castro's prison and more than a spectacular panopticon photograph. The place offers a rare view of the distance between a building and the institution inside it. One can be remarkably stable, while the other changes purpose again and again. On paper, the model was supposed to organize behavior. In practice, power kept rewriting the model. The men changed. The governments changed. The categories changed. The circles remain long enough to become evidence of all of them, and there is one final correction worth keeping with the image. Presidio Modelo was not the perfect realization of Bentham's panopticon, and it should not be sold as the only prison that ever made his design real. Its history is more interesting without that claim. Cuba borrowed from an American prison, adapted a larger tradition of circular surveillance, built an ambitious institution, and then watched the operating reality move away from the promise attached to the plan. The prison could make men visible. It could not make power consistent. Presidio Modelo is a national monument now. The rotundas remain the part most people remember, because concrete is easier to preserve than intention. The circles are still there. The model is not. We go inside the places empires built beyond their own borders, one island at a time. And the empires built a great many of them.